I didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even slam the door. Just took off my wedding ring, placed it on the counter, and walked out. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fridge. Bianca was upstairs, probably finishing up another late-night work call. Or so she always said. I grabbed my duffel from the closet, packed a few changes of clothes, my shaving kit, and the leather-bound notebook where I sketched my latest designs. My hands moved steady, not shaking. Not yet. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, that sharp, expensive floral she always wore to business dinners. I let out a slow breath, shut the bedroom door behind me, and walked out into the cool night. My truck sat where it always did, right in the driveway. I climbed in, fired up the engine, and pulled out without a second glance at the house. My house. The one I built, paid for, poured years into. 15 minutes later, I was pulling up to the Iron Oak, the only bar worth a damn in town. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull red glow on the pavement. It wasn't a place for loud music or trendy cocktails. Just a long bar, a jukebox that only played country, and men who had more stories than they'd ever tell. Ian Zimmerman, my oldest friend, stood behind the bar, wiping down a glass. He was built like a man who spent his life lifting things he didn't complain about. Stocky, thick arms, a permanent scowl that hit a sharp mind. He looked up as I walked in, then down at the bag in my hand. Hell happened to you? I slid onto a stool, setting the bag at my feet. Whiskey. Neat. Ian poured without another word. He knew when to talk and when to shut up. I took the glass, let the burn settle in my chest, then exhaled. She cheated. His hand tightened around the bottle, just for a second, before he set it down. Bianca. No, the mailman. Yeah, Bianca. Ian let out a breath, leaned against the bar. You sure? I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, scrolled to the photos the private investigator sent me. Hotel receipts. Messages. A picture of her, sitting across from some sharp-dressed prick in a high-end restaurant, leaning in too close. A name underlined in red, Caden Robinson. Ian didn't ask to see the phone. He just nodded. Well, that's a hell of a thing. I took another sip, letting the whiskey dull the edge of it. I walked out. Good. Silence stretched between us, the kind that didn't need filling. The jukebox crackled, an old Johnny Cash song playing low. A few regulars sat in the booths, nursing their drinks, wrapped up in their own worlds. Ian finally spoke again. What's the plan? I rolled the glass between my fingers, staring at the amber liquid. Ain't figured that part out yet. But I'm not crawling back. He grunted. Damn right you're not. I smirked, but it didn't last long. The weight of it all settled in. 20 years of marriage, just thrown away for a few cheap hotel rooms and the thrill of something new. Didn't see it coming? Ian asked. I shook my head. Guess I should have. She'd been different for a while. Always on the phone, always talking about work. Cold as hell, but I figured it was stress. Turns out, stress has a name and an expense account. Ian grabbed another glass, poured himself a drink, and clinked it against mine. To new beginnings. I took the toast, even if I wasn't sure what the hell that looked like yet. The night stretched on. A couple more drinks. A few words that didn't mean much, but felt necessary. Ian didn't give advice unless you asked for it. But as I stood to leave, he said, Don't do anything stupid. I slung the bag over my shoulder. Define stupid. Ian gave me a look. You know exactly what I mean. I didn't answer, just nodded and headed for the door. The cool air hit my face, clearing my head a little. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going home. I drove with no real destination, just the road stretching ahead, the dark countryside rolling past in silence. The hum of the tires, the occasional flicker of headlights from another car. It all gave me just enough noise to think without drowning in it. I ended up at my shop, Brooks Leatherworks, the one place that still felt like mine. The old brick building sat quiet in the moonlight, the hand-painted sign hanging over the door, the windows dark. I parked around back, unlocked the heavy oak door, and stepped inside. The smell of tanned hides, beeswax, and oil filled the air, grounding me. My workbench was just as I'd left it. Half-finished belts laid out, tools neatly arranged, a strip of thick saddle leather waiting for the next careful cut. I shrugged off my jacket, hung it on the peg by the door, then ran a hand over my workbench. This was where I belonged. Not in that house. Not with her. The back office had a cot. I'd used it plenty of times when work ran late, and I didn't feel like driving home. Now, It'd be home for a while. I dropped my bag beside it, sat on the edge, and let out a slow breath. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that pressed against your ribs, made you take stock of what was left. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. A second later, I heard a familiar voice. "You here, old man?" I grunted, rubbing a hand over my face as I stood. "Jesus, Danny, you know normal people knock." Daniel Kelly, my youngest apprentice, barely 25, built like a scarecrow, and still had the energy of a man who hadn't been kicked around by life yet. He stood in the doorway, coffee in one hand, a brown paper bag in the other. His hair was a mess, his hoodie had grease stains on it, and he smelled like burnt toast. "You weren't home. Figured I'd find you here," he said, stepping inside and setting the coffee down. "Brought breakfast. Though, if you want something edible, you might want to take this as a peace offering and drive somewhere else." I picked up the coffee, took a sip, and gave him a look. "Where the hell do you buy this?" "A tire shop." Danny smirked. "It's got caffeine. What more do you want?" I shook my head, sitting back against the workbench. "I take it you heard. Small town, boss. People were talking before you even left the driveway." He hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "You okay?" I wasn't. But I also wasn't about to sit here and spill my guts to a kid who still thought the worst thing in life was a breakup over text. I just nodded. "I will be." Danny watched me for a second, then gave a half shrug. "Well, if you want to punch something, I messed up a belt yesterday. You can take your frustration out on recutting it." I let out a breath, almost a laugh. "That bad, huh?" "Bad enough that I didn't want to leave it for you to find first thing in the morning." He picked at the edge of the paper bag, then got a little more serious. "You need anything, just say the word." I nodded again, appreciating the fact that he didn't try to make this into something it wasn't. "No, you'll get through this nonsense. Just a simple offer of help." The bell over the shop door jingled, and I turned to see another familiar face. Joel Kelly, the old gardener, stood in the doorway, leaning on his cane. His overalls were dusted with dirt, his sunnet pulled low, and his sharp eyes took in the scene without a word. He studied me for a long moment, then just said, "Storm's coming." I frowned, glancing toward the window. The sky was clear. "You see rain?" Joel shook his head. "Ain't talking about the weather." He didn't elaborate, just gave me a knowing look and walked back out, moving slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Danny whistled low. "Man gives me the creeps when he does that." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. "Yeah, well, he's not wrong. I wasn't done with Bianca. Not yet. I didn't go back to the house. Didn't call. Didn't text. Let her sit in the silence of it, wondering where I was, wondering what I knew. If she was expecting me to storm in, demand explanations, give her the chance to spin some excuse, she was going to be disappointed. Instead, I worked. The days blurred together inside the shop. Orders to fill, students to teach, leather to cut and stitch. My hands stayed busy, and that was enough for now. But under it all, a slow burn built in my chest, the kind of heat that doesn't fade, only waits for the right moment to be set loose. The first real crack in Bianca's composure came on the third day. I was behind the counter, oiling a fresh set of saddlebags, when the front door swung open hard enough to rattle the bell. She stood there in her tailored suit, hair pinned back sharp, eyes scanning the shop like she expected to find something hidden in the corners. "You're really not coming home?" she asked, voice tight, controlled. I didn't look up from my work. "Not today. Maybe not ever." A pause. I could hear the way she was breathing, quick and shallow. She hadn't expected this, me being calm, not chasing after her, not asking why. "I don't understand what you're doing," she said, stepping inside, lowering her voice like we were having a private conversation. "You just leave? No fight? No discussion?" I set down the saddlebag, finally meeting her eyes. "What's left to discuss?" She folded her arms, shifting her weight like she wanted to pace but wouldn't let herself. "You can't just disappear and act like that's a solution." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "Solution to what, Bianca? To you lying to my face? To you sneaking off with some French businessman while I was home running the life we built?" Her jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." I reached into the drawer, pulled out the folder the private investigator had given me, and slid it across the counter. "I know enough." She hesitated before picking it up, flipping through the pages. I watched the flicker of emotion cross her face, surprise first, then frustration, then something else she buried fast. Her fingers tightened around the paper. "This is why you left? Because you had someone following me?" I gave a short, humorless laugh. "No, I left because you broke something I ain't willing to fix. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. She finally set the folder down, smoothing the edges with careful fingers. This isn't as simple as you think. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the counter. It's exactly as simple as I think. You made a choice. So did I. She exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on her purse. So that's it? You're just going to throw everything away? I stared at her for a long moment before answering. I didn't throw a damn thing. You did. She blinked, just once, but I caught it. A crack in the armor. I expected more, anger, excuses, maybe even a plea. Instead, she just straightened her shoulders, smoothed her jacket, and nodded like she was filing something away for later. I'll have my lawyer call you, she said, turning on her heel and walking out. The door swung shut behind her, the bell jingling like this was just another customer coming and going. I watched her disappear down the street, her pace quick, heels clicking against the pavement. Then I picked up the folder, tossed it in the drawer, and went back to work. She wasn't ready for what came next. I didn't hear from her for a few days after that. Not directly, anyway. But I knew she was unraveling. It was in the way her routines shifted. The way people started looking at me differently in town, like they'd caught wind of something but weren't sure if they should ask. Bianca had always prided herself on control. Image mattered. She liked everything neat, contained. But now, she was the one under a microscope. It started small. A friend of hers, one of those corporate types she had coffee with on weekends, stopped by the shop under the excuse of looking for a new leather portfolio. She lingered longer than necessary, throwing in casual questions. So, how's Bianca holding up? I kept my hand steady as I ran my blade through a thick hide, slicing it clean. You tell me. Her smile faltered. She's just worried about you, Blake. Said you won't talk to her. I set the knife down, wiped my hands on my apron, and met her eyes. Nothing left to talk about. That was enough to send her scurrying, but it wasn't just the friends. It was the small things, Bianca changing her gym schedule, avoiding places we used to go together, leaving the office earlier than usual. Like she was expecting someone to be watching. And she was right. She didn't know it yet, but I'd hired someone new, a quiet guy named Miller, recommended through an old acquaintance. Discreet, professional. He was keeping tabs, and the updates were piling up. She'd stopped seeing Caden, at least in public. Their usual restaurant? She hadn't been back in weeks. No more out-of-town trips. No more hotel charges. She was pulling back, probably trying to figure out how much I really knew. It wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel it. The weight of it pressing down, the uncertainty creeping in, that sickening doubt of wondering just how far I was willing to go. So I gave her a push. I sent her a single text. You sure you covered your tracks? No context. No follow-up. Just that. It didn't take long. Less than 5 minutes before my phone buzzed with a call from her. I let it ring out. Then another text. What are you talking about? I didn't respond. Just let it sit. Let her wonder. By that evening, Miller sent me a message. She's making calls. Checking bank statements. Looked over her shoulder twice at the coffee shop. She's rattled. Good. I spent the next few days keeping things normal. Working at the shop, training Danny. Meeting orders. Letting the paranoia do the work for me. Then, late one evening, I made sure I was sitting at the Iron Oak, right at the bar where Ian could see me, when Bianca walked in. She didn't belong in a place like this. Too polished, too controlled. Even in jeans and a sweater, she stuck out like a sore thumb. But she walked straight up, barely sparing Ian a glance, and slid onto the stool beside me. We need to talk. I took my time finishing my drink. Set the glass down. Then I turned, meeting her eyes. Talk. She lowered her voice. I don't know what game you're playing, but I need it to stop. I smirked. You think this is a game? Her jaw tightened. I don't know what you told people, but I can feel it. The way they look at me. The way my own coworkers hesitate when I walk into a room. It's like she exhaled sharply. Like I'm being watched. I kept my face unreadable. Maybe you are. For the first time, real doubt flickered across her face. Blake, if you want to be done, fine. Be done. But don't drag this out. Don't try to ruin me. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low, controlled. You ruined yourself. She stared at me, frustration mixing with something else. A hesitation. A crack in her composure. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. Might admit something. But instead, she straightened, smoothing her hands over her jeans like she needed to erase the conversation from her skin. I hope this makes you feel better, she said, standing up. But just remember, when you push someone into a corner, You don't always like how they come out. She walked out without another word. Ian let out a low whistle, setting a fresh glass in front of me. You sure you know what you're doing? I picked up the drink, let the burn settle. Then I smirked. I guess we'll find out. Miller sent the final report a week later. He'd done his job well. Bianca had been careful, but not careful enough. The bank statements showed transfers she thought were buried. The phone logs had calls she didn't think anyone would see. The restaurant bills, the hotel bookings, all the things she figured had been erased, laid out in black and white. She hadn't just cheated, she'd used joint accounts to cover some of it. Small amounts here and there, just enough to go unnoticed. That was all I needed. I had the folder sitting on the counter in my shop when Ian walked in, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't need to ask what it was. He just pulled up a stool and poured himself a coffee from the pot in the corner. So, he said, stretching the word out. What's the plan? I took my time answering. Turned the folder around, flipped through the pages, let the weight of it settle. I could bury her, I said finally. File for divorce, drag this through court, make sure she walks out with nothing but bad credit and regret. Ian sipped his coffee. Sounds about right. I closed the folder. But I don't need a courtroom. I just need her to know I could. Ian nodded slowly. You gonna do it in public? No, I said, setting the folder aside. This is between me and her. Bianca came to the shop after work, probably expecting me to be somewhere else. I could tell the second she walked in that she had spent the day bracing for whatever was coming. The way she set her purse down, the way her eyes flicked to the workbench like she was already trying to read the situation. I gestured to the stool across from me. Sit. She hesitated, then did. I slid the folder across the counter. Go ahead. Take a look. Her fingers hovered over it before she flipped it open. She scanned the pages, her breath slowing. By the time she reached the last one, she set the papers down carefully, smoothing them with her palm. I see, she said finally. That's it. I leaned back, folding my arms. You see? She exhaled sharply. What do you want me to say, Blake? That I made a mistake? That I should have done things differently? I shook my head. I don't need you to say anything. I just need you to understand something. I tapped the folder. I have enough here to make sure you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, your clean little life. I let that sit before continuing. But I won't. Her eyes snapped to mine. You don't deserve a scene. I'm not going to be the guy standing in a courtroom, dragging this out for the next year while you sit there pretending to be the victim. I leaned in slightly. But make no mistake. If you try to take a damn thing from me, if you so much as look at my business, my money, or anything I built, I will. Her fingers tightened on the papers. I sat back. I'm filing the divorce papers tomorrow. You get nothing. You walk away clean, and we both forget this ever happened. She swallowed, setting the folder back down. And if I don't, I smiled. You won't like what happens next. She held my gaze for a long moment, searching for something. Maybe weakness, maybe regret. She didn't find either. Finally, she nodded once. Fine. She stood, picking up her purse. I thought she might say something else, but she just turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind her, and just like that, it was done. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the papers, letting the silence settle. Then I grabbed a knife, picked up a fresh sheet of leather, and got back to work. The divorce went through without a fight. She knew better than to test me. No drawn-out court battles, no splitting assets. She signed, packed her things, and moved out within the month. I didn't ask where she went, didn't care. What I did care about was what came next. The house felt like a shell, too many memories packed into walls I didn't want anymore. So I sold it. Fast. Didn't haggle, didn't hold out for a better offer. Some young couple with big dreams and no history bought it, and that was fine by me. I moved into the apartment above my shop. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with a small kitchen, a couch that had seen better days, and a view of the street that wasn't much to look at. But it was mine. No ghosts. Danny came by with a six-pack the first night I was there, tossing one to me before kicking his feet up on the coffee table. Never figured you for the apartment above the shop kind of guy, he said, cracking his beer open. I took a sip, leaning back against the counter. Didn't figure I'd be doing a lot of things. He smirked. So what's next? Gonna get a dog? Start a new hobby? I snorted. Leatherwork is my hobby. Yeah, well, you need something else now, old man. I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. The shop took up most of my time, but when I wasn't there, I started taking long drives out to the countryside, just to clear my head. That's how I ended up in Mason Creek, a small town about 2 hours from here, where an old friend of my father's still ran a workshop. Cody Carter, a master craftsman, hands like iron, built saddles that lasted generations. I hadn't seen him in years, but when I showed up at his shop, he took one look at me, wiped his hands on his apron, and nodded toward a workbench. "Grab a knife," he said. "I got a commission I could use help with." Didn't ask what I was doing there. Didn't ask why. Just put me to work. For the next few weeks, I split my time between my own shop and Mason Creek. Cody taught community classes on the weekends, kids and younger guys looking to learn the trade. I hadn't taught outside my own apprentices before, but when Cody threw me in, I found I didn't mind it. "You always had patience," he said one evening, sitting on the porch, a glass of bourbon in hand. "You just never had time." I nodded, watching the sun dip below the trees. Funny how fast that changes. One night, I stopped at a little roadside diner just outside of town, ordered a black coffee, sat at the counter, and watched the waitress bustle around, refilling mugs and calling orders back to the kitchen. A woman slid onto the stool next to me, setting down her bag. I barely glanced at her until she spoke. "You're Blake Brooks." I turned fully then, taking her in. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. "I am," I said. "You got me at a disadvantage." She offered a small smile. "Isabel Robinson." The last name hit first. Robinson, as in Caden Robinson. She must have seen something shift in my expression because she held up a hand. "I'm not here to defend him." I leaned back slightly, studying her. "Then what are you here for?" She took a breath. "To say I'm sorry. Not for him. He's a bastard, and we don't talk much. But when I heard what happened, I figured you deserved to know that not all of us co-sign his choices." I watched her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." She hesitated, then reached into her bag and slid a small envelope across the counter. "This is for you." I picked it up, but didn't open it right away. "What is it?" She gave a slight shrug. "Closure, if you want it." Then she stood, gave me one last look, and walked out. I sat there for a long time before finally opening the envelope. Inside was a single folded note, written in neat, careful handwriting. "Some debts can't be repaid, but that doesn't mean we don't try." No signature. Nothing else. I read it twice, then slid it back into the envelope, set it on the counter, and signaled for a refill. Some things you fix. Others, you leave behind. Either way, you keep moving. A year later, I stood behind the counter of Brooks Leatherworks, running my hands over a finished saddle, checking every stitch, every cut. The shop smelled like oil and fresh leather, the kind of scent that settled into your bones if you spent long enough around it. The place was busy today, orders stacked up, new apprentices learning the trade. Danny stood by the workbench, running a strip of leather through his hands. "You checking that saddle for the third time, or are you just admiring your own handiwork?" I smirked, giving it a final nod before setting it aside. Both. Business had been better than ever. After Bianca left, after the dust settled, something changed. Word spread about the shop, about the work we did. People came in from out of town, looking for quality, looking for something that wasn't mass-produced garbage. It felt good. Felt solid. Ian walked in, slapping a hand against the doorframe. "You got 5 minutes for a beer, or are you too busy being a responsible business owner?" I grabbed my coat. Always got time. We walked down the street to the Iron Oak. Same bar, same faces, but things felt different now. Cleaner. Like I'd cut out all the rot and left nothing but solid wood underneath. Ian slid me a bottle before cracking open his own. "So, how's it feel, being a free man?" I leaned back against the bar, taking a sip. "Lighter." He grunted. "She still around?" I shook my head. "Moved to the city. Took a job in some high-rise. Haven't heard a word since the papers were signed." Ian smirked. "And the Frenchman?" I chuckled. "Last I heard, he got divorced too. Guess playing the field didn't work out long-term." Ian took a drink, then shrugged. Poetic justice. The door opened, and for half a second, I thought it might be Bianca walking in. But it wasn't. Just another customer, another piece of the town moving along like it always did. I drained the rest of my beer, set the empty bottle down, and pushed away from the bar. "I'm heading out." Ian gave me a nod. "See you tomorrow." The evening air was cool, the kind that carried the promise of rain later. I walked back toward the shop, passing familiar faces, nodding at old friends. The town was still the same, but I wasn't. Back at the shop, I took one last look around before locking up. The machines, the tools, the stacks of finished work, this was mine. Not some house full of memories I didn't want. Not a marriage built on something that rotted underneath. Just this. I pulled my truck keys from my pocket, but before I left, I glanced at the workbench one last time. The saddle was still there, perfect, finished. A damn good piece of work. I ran a hand over it, satisfied, then shut off the lights. Some things you fix. Others, you walk away from. Either way, you build something better.